Good afternoon, everybody. I'm John Oberdorfer, I'm president of the foundation, and I'm excited to welcome you to this conversation among our fellows. From our first class in 2005 to members in our class of 2020. And we are so pleased that so many of you, especially from the earlier years, are joining us today. Today's participating fellows span geographically from Brussels to California and from Texas to Canada. And welcome to board members, members of the Dean Circle, and many new and longtime friends from far. I believe we have people from Australia and from near. And thank you to Marnie Lennon, Associate Dean at the University of Miami School of Law, for your ideas and for your coordination of this Zoom broadcast. And to Dee Sparks for her coordinating all the logistics for today. Today's conversation springs from the Foundation's letter to all 270 of our fellows, which was written on the day between the celebration of Dr. King's birthday and the inauguration. The letter, which I think we circulated to you yesterday again, denounced the attacks on the Capitol, on our democracy, and on the rule of law. And it reflected on the Foundation's legacy and mission. And it asked how we all can and should build constructively and positively toward the Constitution's goal of a more perfect union. Why this conversation today? Well, it's well answered in the prologue of a recent book, First Principles, which says, there is little certain about our nation, except that it remains an experiment that requires our serious and sustained attention to thrive. That is what we're doing today, giving our nation our serious and sustained attention. We begin with opening remarks by 2020 fellow Bobby Vondrasek, a member of the Nebraska National Guard. Bobby was deployed to Washington for the inauguration. You almost have to just stop when you say that. It's so incredible to mention. Charlottesville Chief of Police, Dr. Rochelle Brackney, will speak next, and we are honored that Chief Brackney and her police department are partners with us in our new Racial Justice Fellowship program this coming summer. Then Dean Margaret McCabe of the University of Arkansas School of Law and Justin DiChiara, a firm lawyer and co-chair of the Foundation's Alumni Committee, will moderate a discussion among the fellows, beginning with a kickoff group of 4 and then inviting the thoughts of all our other fellows with us today. At the end, our distinguished chair, Rodney Slater, will wrap up. Will we have answers today? Perhaps, but more importantly, a thought-provoking and inspiring exchange among our fellows, who themselves are very inspiring and future leaders. So with that, let me invite Bobby to lead us off here.
Thank you, John. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a third-year law student at the University of Colorado, and as John mentioned, a 2020 public policy fellow. And I'm also a member of the Nebraska Air National Guard. I have been since 2011, serving as an enlisted intelligence analyst that entire time. And after the events of January 6th, when the question was asked for volunteers, I happily volunteered to go to DC to be part of inauguration security operations. And while there, I served as the chief of intelligence on the command staff for the Nebraska Joint Task Force, which was about 350 people deployed to DC. And as the chief of intelligence, I spent most of my days receiving reports from the FBI and Department of Homeland Security on possible threats to the inauguration, as well as threats against National Guard members themselves and police and various other vague threats all around the DC area. And I was in command briefing rooms most of the time, but I was also walking around the district, looking at troop movements, and security issues and posturing around the city. And I've traveled to DC many times. I'm very familiar with the city. I've walked the halls of Congress and many of the congressional office buildings. And it was just so surreal. I was happy to be there, but it was also very sad to me to see our nation's capital the way it was. For people that weren't there, it was kind of hard to realize, but virtually the entire city was vacant, except for National Guard members. There were, downtown, the National Mall, the Congressional Complex were completely vacant. It was like everyone had left. And in reflecting on this historical experience, I tried to, kind of ponder what was I going to take away from this? What am I going to remember about this experience? And two things sort of came to mind for me. And the first was just the surreal experience of being in the same place and time as so many norm-breaking, shattering events, one right after the other. Congressional members contesting a free and fair election, followed by the insurrection where 5 people died, followed by this massive mobilization, and something that I realized and remembered was that when we see so many of these norm-breaking events, one right after the other, that we have seen many of which in recent years, is that we often forget the one that happened last week, or when we do think of the one that happened last week, it seems normal or appropriate in comparison to the one that happened today. And we kind of lose our sense of morality and just space and time of, when there's so much outrageous behavior, either from political leaders or, with the insurrection and the protests, we kind of forget the functioning of our democracy and how things should be. And so I tried to reflect on that and think about that as, a component of democracy and the rule of law is that we have norms and they're only really good if people follow them. And the second thing that became apparent to me while in DC was reflecting on one of my favorite pastimes in DC, which is going to the Smithsonian portrait galleries. And in one of my experiences there, I looked at the Eisenhower portrait, and right next to it, they have a PBS series about Eisenhower and his involvement in the integration of Central High School at Little Rock and the events in Little Rock where Eisenhower, in a similar situation, deployed troops to a situation where a riotous mob was interfering with the lawful course of government and the implementation of the rule of law and federal court orders. And, it was obvious to me how, just different it was, what I was experiencing compared to something that we are in some ways repeating in history. And the lessons of history are kind of obvious and apparent to us half a century ago, where the chief executive got on television and made it very clear that the federal courts will say what the law is, and mob rule will not stand in the United States. And our rule of law and the respect of our federal courts and people respecting the rule of law is only as good as everyone doing their part to support the rule of law and to enforce federal court orders. So in conclusion, I think what I got out of my experience more than anything was, in the day-to-day political jockeying back and forth, we go through all sorts of issues, but sometimes we forget about kind of the fundamental components and operations of democracy, free and fair elections, the rule of law, things of that nature. And so that's kind of going to be top of my mind going forward. So with that, I will hand it over to Chief.
Thank you so much. Thank you, and welcome. I'm excited to be here. I'm going to take it a little bit of a different perspective. I sit in the center of Charlottesville, where in 2017 started a lot of these conversations um, in a place that has been now known and tagged as an epicenter of hate. I sit in this space as a multi-ethnic woman who identifies as Black, who has challenges when we talk about law, procedural justice, as I wear a uniform, as I balance the tensions of being a woman, being Black, and living in a space where Confederate flags and monuments are a way of life, where my everyday, I'm very comfortable with people referring to me using ethnic slurs, referring to me as an affirmative action hire, and all of the other things that go along with that. So I took, when I was thinking about your charge, the rule of law, and how do you move towards a more perfect union. So I wrote a few things that were reflecting about my experience here, and as it has been further compounded by what many Black and Brown persons in our communities were not shocked by the events of January 6th. For most of us, we just couldn't figure out what took it so long because that is the space we operate in. So the rule of law, is it enough to move us towards a more perfect union? The rule of law provides us with a sense of comfort, guardrails and boundaries, and sure footedness. The laws provide us with stability upon which we can rely. It forms the basis for a more perfect union. The preamble to the Constitution highlighted our hopes, our values that we had ascribed to, but they were not included in the document itself. The Constitution, the rule of law was that pathway. It was the pathway forward. It formalized and concrete in many of its ways our hopes. The rule of law, though, is often used as a rallying cry when high profile incidents based in criminality find their way into social mediums. You'll hear journalists or prosecutors or pundits, historians and professors often retort, no one is above the law during their analyses of these incidents, as constant reminders that regardless of our status, our race, our religion, or our wealth, or other demographics, no one is above the law. No one above the law unites us and perhaps moves us towards a more perfect union. That responsibility includes the policing profession, which has often been a divisive instrument, lacking justice, failing to guarantee domestic tranquility, promoting the general welfare of some, and robbing the blessings from others of we, the people. Policing and public safety are vital components of the criminal legal system. And fellows, so are you and your work. When the rule is not enough to ensure a safe and democratic society, your work, our work, allows us to imagine and create systems that advance us towards that lofty goal of a more perfect union. In order to get there, we must first understand what divides us. There's evidence of racial disparities at many levels in our criminal legal systems, and often the roots of those disparities aren't clear. Experts point to systemic institutional supremacy as well as implicit, largely unconscious biases that manifest themselves in the application and implementation of your laws. To be sure, biases aren't unique to police, but in the matters of criminal justice, implicit bias can have life altering implications. One of the most well demonstrated and deeply entrenched types of implicit bias is that unconscious association between Black and Brown individuals and crime. None of those associations occurred on January 6th. That association can influence an officers, prosecutors, and legislators' fashioning and crafting of their legislation. It can influence your defense preparations and our willingness to be and value the humanity in each person we contact. And according to Angela Davis, freedom is a constant struggle. No amount of psychological therapy or group training can effectively address racism in this country unless we begin to dismantle the structures of racism, quote. This will require demolition of our systems, a restructuring of our organizations, a reallocating of our resources based on community needs and priorities, maybe even a rebranding, reshaping, and recontouring the rules of law. Fellows, your responsibility, our collective responsibility, requires a shifting of our attitudes, our beliefs, power, authority, our allies, and our alliances, a movement from procedures and laws to procedural justice in laws, with an emphasis on fairness, resolving disputes, reallocating resources, promoting positive outcomes, and therefore creating a more perfect union. Thank you.
That
Very
was that was terrific, both Bobby and Dr. Brackney. Margaret McCabe here with Justin and John. I think we can go from here. I just want to thank both Bobby and Dr. Brackney for their public service, as well as their time today to really give us insight into their experiences. And now we're going to talk with 4 of our fellows about their reactions to what they've just heard and some questions that I know Justin and I have been working on. Justin, do you want to start by introducing our first 2 fellows, and then I'll introduce the next 2?
Sure thing. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to echo Dean McCabe's thanks to both Dr. Brackney and to Bobby. Today we have 4 great guests with us, 4 panelists that were fellows with the Squire Patton Boggs Foundation. The first is Julia Spiegel. Ms. Spiegel was a 2011 fellow from Yale. She did her fellowship while she was with the Squire Patton Boggs Foundation at the Department of State. She's now a deputy county counsel for the social justice and doing social justice and impact litigation for Santa Clara County Counsel's Office. She's also a lecturer in international policy studies at Stanford. With degrees from Yale, Stanford, and Princeton, Ms. Spiegel also has been a senior advisor at the U.S. mission to the UN. She serves on the Bay Area Next Generation Steering Committee for UNICEF and the National Advisory Board of Stanford's Haas Center. She has also conducted research and advocacy on armed conflict in Africa for the International Crisis Group and the Center for American Progress. Next, we have Diane Lake. Diane is a JD candidate at Yale Law School, originally from Freetown, Sierra Leone. Her family immigrated to the US following the Sierra Leonean Civil War and has since been based in Los Angeles. She graduated with a BA in political science and women's gender and sexuality studies from Yale College in 2016, where she completed her senior thesis on the transformative effects of women's political participation in Liberia, Rwanda, and Sierra Leone, and the development paradoxes that hinder gender equality in post-conflict African nations. Before attending law school, Diane worked as a Woodbridge Fellow for the Yale Office of International Affairs and curated Yale's Contemporary African Arts and Culture Festival, African Salon. At Yale Law School, she serves as the president of the Black Law Students Association and a dean's advisor. She's also actively engaged in human rights work as a law student intern in the Allard K. Lowenstein International Human Rights Clinic. From what we heard from Diane last time we saw her, Diane will be joining Arnold and Porter after she graduates from law school.
Great, thank you, Justin. Let me now introduce very proudly Marion Humphrey, who is a 3L at the University of Arkansas here in Fayetteville. He is also serving as a National Juvenile Justice Network Fellow. And I know Marion to be very committed to juvenile justice reform. And he was a 2018 Squire Patton Boggs Fellow serving at the Campaign for Youth Justice. At our law school, Marion is very involved in BALSTA, has been an advocate for change and also inspiration from his fellow students about commitment to public service and commitment to bettering communities. So thank you for being here, Marion. Last but certainly not least is Reynaldo Machin, who is from Puerto Rico. He's currently at the university at Howard University School of Law, but he's also a PhD from the University of Iowa. He's a USPTO patent agent and he is a 2020 fellow, and want you all to know that he has founded a really fascinating platform called Bench to Bench, designed to support conversations in the Latinx community about science and legal issues. And I just think that is, we've got a terrific group of fellows to really reflect and share with us your thoughts on that question of, rule of law and achieving a more perfect union. So Justin, if I may begin with the first question, I think maybe we'll just go in order and hear our fellows' reactions in the way that you were introduced. But Bobby spoke about norm shattering events. And Dr. Brackney has also raised the specter with Angela Davis's words of like, what does it look like going forward? What needs to be changed? What needs to be different? And my question for our fellows is, in your careers and in your experience, where do we find our norms, particularly knowing, as Bobby has said, many of them have been shattered as of late. So Julia, I'll start with you. What do you think? Where do we find our norms as we think about rule of law going forward?
Sure, thank you so much. I'm happy to answer that softball question, to kick things off. And first, let me just, thank Bobby and Chief Brackney for your really inspiring remarks. And of course, John and Rodney and the foundation. This is such a thought-provoking and really important conversation. And I so value the time and space to actually take a step back and think about this as we live through the whirlwind of events that we have gone through just in the last few months. It's so useful to have the moment to really pause in it. So thank you. I will, to address your question, Dean McCabe, I think maybe I'll just start by offering a few reflections on my sort of lens through this work, in part here at the County of Santa Clara, where, as Justin mentioned, I work for the social justice impact litigation team. And as part of that work, actually, I am counsel to our registrar of voters, which is the office that actually administered the election in November. And so I wanted to offer just a few reflections on that as some context to ground it in a different piece of the law, which, I think in many ways is part of that effort in moving towards procedural justice. As Chief Brackney mentioned, each day we are trying to make those allocation decisions and invest those resources to actually enshrine those changes in the very institutions of government here at a local level. And to your point, Dean McCabe, to actually build up those norms on a day-to-day basis. And so I wanted to just reflect on the election a little bit because I think it's a useful example. And so, the aftermath of that, I thought there were sort of, I'd share some thoughts just both on the good and the bad of that. So, the good is that I think our institutions and our norms did largely work with respect to the rule of law with the November election. That, this may surprise you, but I'm actually still defending the county in a lawsuit that is seeking to decertify the election results from November. So decertify every California voter's vote from the election is still ongoing. But notwithstanding that, stepping back, the courts did their jobs, notwithstanding that, you had judges of all stripes who heard cases related to the election. They did uphold the law and the Constitution in the face of incredible political pressure, even though there were contests across the country, and that's pretty extraordinary. And so did election administrators. So here at the local level, I just wanted to pause on that too, because I think it speaks so much to your normative question. Despite there being a pandemic for the first time in 100 years, despite, the US Postmaster General intentionally slowing down mail delivery service so that, mail ballots would be slower and may not make it in time to be, postmarked and counted, despite highly divisive rhetoric around the election, on whole, local election administrators were able to pull off an extraordinary feat in administering a generally free and fair and accessible election, which is so important to getting turnout from all sectors of society. And so I do want to pause on that because I think that really is something extraordinary given all the circumstances. And then I'll just note that what I think is more of the bad trend that I think does, again, speak to your question, Dean McCabe, about norms and where we are. So we made it through this election, and we do in fact have a new president, as I think others would all acknowledge who are with us today. But, unfortunately, we do have a huge subset of the populace, some 40% of the country, that doesn't actually believe this election was free and fair. Or, that election administrators, which are typically nonpartisan and do the bread and butter of making sure you get your mail ballots or that their drop boxes or the vote centers are operating, that they can't be trusted. And so while we sort of eked by this past election, I do think we have tremendous work to be done because of the significant normative damage around the election and how much trust and faith the American populace can put in those institutions as we go forward. So I suppose, you know, I think we sort of made it through this last round of attacks on those systems, but a tremendous normative damage has been done. And so I do think it's incumbent on all of us to figure out how we work to build that up as we move towards the next election. You know, we can sort of breathe a sigh of relief for now, but there's so much work that we need to be done. And to Chief Brackney's point, that's sort of, we all have to be thinking about how we push our resources, push the, you know, take it incumbent on each of us to push those normative bounds.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Julia, for sharing your perspective on the election in particular and reminding us that the system by and large worked, but was under heavy attack, and that's something we want to think about. The norms are there, but maybe there's a loss of belief in many of those norms. Diane, I'd love to know what your thoughts are about kind of where do we find our norms in light of the comments from Bobby and Dr. Brackney.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me to participate in this and holding this space for us fellows and guests to reflect on this question. I think what I've been thinking about a lot in regards to this question is how I would approach it were the United States another country and I was doing international human rights work, how would I approach this question? The rule of law to me is a very powerful tool for peace and democracy that champions accountability, equality, and fairness under the law. And in developing countries or in stable regimes, the lack of a strong rule of law is more obvious, which is why I think so much international human rights work is devoted to strengthening the rule of law abroad. And thinking about international human rights work in the various capacities I've worked with it, it's always been bizarre to me how little attention is put towards strengthening human rights and rule of law in the US in the same way. In developing countries, I think, in developed countries, I think there's a delicate interplay between the rule of law and social justice and social progress that is often overlooked. And I think one of my biggest concerns about the rule of law here in the United States is that it's typically taken for granted. And I think most dangerously by those who we would consider our peers in the legal profession. The rule of law would not have eroded to the point to the point of insurrection on January 6th if many other anti-democratic and some inhumane acts hadn't been allowed to happen before that. And some people think that the most egregious of which happened was the efforts to overturn the presidential vote, which was assisted by countless lawyers. But I think before that, there are many other apparent threats to the rule of law. And if anything, I think these past 4 years, the rule of law has been used as an excuse, as a crutch for some politicians, lawyers, regular people to avoid doing the necessary and difficult work that true justice actually requires. I don't think the rule of law is something that remains stagnant. I believe it's an ever-evolving vehicle for the promotion of human rights and human dignity that should always evolve towards justice and fairness. As Chief Brackney touched upon earlier, there are many times in this nation's history where the rule of law has been relied upon to perpetuate great injustice. So there is rightfully skepticism among many about whether the rule of law actually serves minorities, whether it actually serves vulnerable communities. So I don't think the rule of law is in and of itself an infallible concept. Rather, I think that in a society in which the rule of law can truly deliver peace and stability, the rule of law is aspirational. So to me, complacency is a grave threat to that. Lawyers, law schools, law firms, every legal institution, I think through silence and complacency can themselves be a threat to the rule of law. After many years under the Trump administration, the personal lives of many people in America, particularly those with political clout, did not actually change much personally. And so I think maybe many people were under the impression that the system would just autocorrect itself. because of this trust in the rule of law, but without putting in actual effort to ensure that that would happen. So I guess, you know, to wrap up my thoughts, and what I would love to hear from the other fellows about is, you know, how do we combat complacency? How do we hold the legal profession and the spaces that we are part of accountable to continuously strengthening and improving upon the rule of law with consideration to social justice? And how do we do that with the same energy and vigor as we do for other countries around the world?
Those are really amazing comments, Diane. Thank you for sharing them. I really like the way you describe the rule of law as not stagnant, but also in search of a stability, but that stability being really supported by, you know, the activism around achieving peace and justice. And that's a really amazing thought. And I'd love to hear what Marion is thinking about this particular question.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you all for the invitation to be here for this very important conversation. I think that the first thing that came to mind was kind of a joke almost from peers that I've seen on social media about young people saying, "I'm tired of living in unprecedented times. I would like to live in some precedented times for once." And I think that rule of law is supposed to tie us through these times. It's supposed to be applicable to each generation. But for me, something that was said earlier in terms of no one is above the law, I think that we have to be honest with each other and realize that for a very long time, that even with the rule of law in place, people are often treated as if they're below the law. And, you know, as someone with an upbringing here in the South part of the United States, you know, I'm also reminded, you know, of my grandmother in conversations when people talk about a minimum wage that she never saw for 40 years working as a domestic worker for a white family. I'm also, you know, I think about exactly with, and I hate to mess up your name, Bobby. I also think about what Bobby von Drossik, what you talked about in terms of my own high school, Little Rock Central High School. Thank you for bringing that up. I think about Brown v. Board, but I also think about the clear disparate educational opportunities available to students who are already marginalized. That's below the law to me. And then I also think about something that I saw, a video I saw this week where a young Black man was walking through the snow and walking in the street. And as someone who experienced the most snow I've seen in Little Rock, Arkansas in my lifetime, 24 inches this past week, I learned that it's easier to walk through the snow because it's often the easiest part, the clearest due to the trucks. And what he experienced as a resident, it's someone who could not rely on rule of law, could not rely on the humanity of those who are empowered by the law to have the decency as a human. So I just want us to also realize that when we consider the implications of rule of law, we have to understand that there have been communities and generations who are still below the law. There are still folks who were deported currently when we were told that that would be stopped for a while. There are still folks who are unhoused, and there's still a great disparity in how COVID has impacted the folks who are most marginalized, the folks who are on the front lines. And this has all happened under a federal guidance, under federal rules, under federal opportunities that should not have allowed that to happen.
Great. Thank you so much, Marion. I think what you remind us of is some norms should be shattered. And that norm of some being below the law, as you so eloquently put it, is one that should be examined as we think about a more perfect union. So thank you for your comments. Last again, but certainly not least, Ronaldo.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for organizing this. I think this is really needed right now. You know, when the topic of today's talk is, right, getting to a more perfect union and what is the rule of law, and it just kind of stopped me for a little bit and thinking, because I've had certain experiences that I think make me unique in the sense that I did my undergrad in Puerto Rico, right, where I was in a completely Hispanic community, and then I injected myself in Iowa, right, where it was a predominantly white community, and now I'm here in DC at Howard University, where it's predominantly African American and minority community, and I've had so many conversations about whether it's racial profiling, lack of opportunities, or just differences in the environment where everybody grew up. And the truth of the matter is that rule of law circumscribes what we can do, but it circumscribes us differently depending on where we're from, our background, where we grew up, our race. I think that after having so many conversations with different people, you realize that it's not the same for everybody. And that definitely needs to change moving forward if we really want to achieve a more perfect union. And what we saw on January 6th is just a reflection of something that had been building up, like everybody's been saying. But I think that there is a problem right now with technology allowing everybody to create their own realities. And how can we really agree as to what is the rule of law if we pretty much live in different realities, right? Like was mentioned before, 40% of Americans, or I don't know if it's of a particular party, actually don't believe the elections were legit. And we got, I think it was Homeland Security who said that this is the safest elections, right? That were not tampered with and everything. And I just stopped to think about, what if all the craziness that happened in the 2016 election had happened now, right? When you had somebody in power that definitely did not want to let go of that power. I think we were lucky in that regard. We learned from what happened in 2016, but it should not go unnoticed. It shouldn't just, we have to continue talking about this, because I see this harming what happened in January 6th, just harming really the foundations of our nation, right? And the rule of law is just that, and it needs to change. But again, I think technology is something that needs to be addressed, whether it's lack of it now in COVID-19. It's just, we got kids who can't even really attend school because they don't have the tech to just move forward. So again, the rule of law is what it is, but it's different for everybody depending on where you're from. So those are my thoughts on it. So
Great. Well, thank you. Those are really helpful. I think what Ronaldo reminds us of too is that there's some new things, right, that don't have norms, like social media and its ability, I like the way you phrased it, to allow people to live in their own realities. And how do you find a norm if people are in their own realities? So to our fellows, that's a great opening round on that question of rule of law and a more perfect union and finding our norms. So Justin, what do you want to talk about now?
Sure. Thanks, Dean McCabe, and thank you to all the panelists for those, very insightful answers. I guess piggybacking off of what Ronaldo talked about, people having different realities, and then what Dean McCabe just said about those different realities often being based on people's social media habits. We've seen kind of in a different context with the rule of law during this pandemic. We've seen large portions of the population in the United States refuse the rule of law imposed upon them by localities and state governments when it comes to health ordinances. For the most part, this seems to be a uniquely American response, at least when you look at how Asian countries and African nations and the EU, and how all these nations all over the world have responded to the coronavirus and how their populations have responded. You can't really see a video from the height of the pandemic of people in Italy or South Korea walking around without masks. But if you looked into a video of many states in the United States, you could see thousands of people without masks, and you still can see thousands of people indoors maskless. And so the question that I have is that, obviously there's a balance that governments have to take with with the idea of rule of law. And, at what point, is it okay for, especially in America where we have individual liberties, for a government to override those individual liberties for the greater good of the people? And then second, is the American Constitution and our rule of law, is it unique to America, or our reaction, is it unique to America because of our Constitution, or is it unique to America because of other reasons? So I guess we can start out with Julia again.
Sure, as the resident local government person, I can be on the hot seat to try and to weigh in. I think I'll just offer, as you were describing the sort of bind that I think a lot of governments are in right now, trying to figure out how to appropriately weigh competing interests, right? Because on the one hand, you've got economic survival and the livelihood of small businesses that are really struggling in a very significant way amidst a crackdown on activities that can occur. And then you've got public health, right? And these are often at odds with each other. And so each locality, each state, and then each nation are supposed to be coming up with this constellation of regulations and guidelines that are supposed to balance those different interests that may well have to vary based on the locality, right? And so it's just to say that it's an extraordinarily difficult feat. And I think there are all sorts of pressures that jurisdictions feel about how can you really make sure that you're not crippling your local economy and these hardworking businesses at the same time as you really want to ensure public health, and how hard it is with access when there are certain people who don't have the choice to get to stay home and isolate, right? Like they have to go in and do their jobs, and so already the pandemic disproportionately affects certain sectors of our community. And so how do we try and counterbalance that is just sort of an overarching thing. But so that is just sort of a frame of the challenge that I think is really a huge one. But as you described it, what kept coming to mind for me was what feels to me, and again, this is almost sort of damning sitting from a local government perch, but it feels to me like a real loss in faith in government, right? Like a real lot, like when we talk about rule of law, what Marian said and Diane and others, Ronaldo, like it feels like there's this thread of, but what's the like, A, do we think everyone actually has equal access to that law? And B, what's the constitution of those laws? Like, do we think they're actually the substance of those laws that we're fighting for are right and just? Like rule of law is, that doesn't actually, it just says there's some laws. It doesn't say what the substance of those laws are. And to me, the real, pushback against compliance with so many of the regulations that local governments and states are trying to put forward does, to me, signify a real loss of trust, in the broader institutions of government, such that we're seeing this breakdown, right? Where local governments may be trying to issue these sort of orders and directives and guidelines, and people don't trust in them. And there can be really good reasons for that, right? And so, and of course, some not so good reasons, but I think that is something that we probably do have to grapple with. And that does feel somewhat unique to America. Obviously, we do also have these, original, a sense of sort of individual liberties and rights that may be unique compared to Europe or New Zealand or elsewhere in the world. So I think that, that is probably an element too, but I can't help but feel that the weight of it to me somehow feels like this real breakdown in trust between institutions that are really supposed to help govern us, and the people are saying, wait, you're not actually meeting my needs and you're not here to take care of them. But I would really love to hear Diane and Marian and Ronaldo's and others' views on that.
Thanks, Julia. Very interesting from your local government expertise. I'm sure the past few months have been, besides the election, but dealing with everything in the pandemic has been really interesting and frightening probably at the same time. Diane, could you speak to us for a little bit about this issue?
Sure. So I think there has been somewhat of a dangerous rewriting of history and rewriting of legal history that has come about, and how different states and the country in general has handled the pandemic and, regulations. I think it's quite concerning, not only for the current situation, but the future of this country, that there exists so many limits to the extent to which there can be there can be restrictions and regulations regarding public health during an emergency, during such a major crisis in this country. And we can see how courts around the country have, it's not just, popular pushback against regulations and lack of compliance from the everyday person who doesn't trust or believe in the government, which I think is a valid point in of itself and a great point that Julia made. But I think around the country, we've also seen courts striking down regulations left and right and arguing that it, based on the history of other emergencies in this country, the regulations that certain counties and states have tried to put forth have been too severe compared to in the past, when that really isn't quite the case. And when we look at the way that this country has had to deal with crises like this in the past, and the type of regulations and very aggressive regulatory action that was taken, we could even look back a century ago to that pandemic. I think there's a lot more that was done and a lot more that was supported than right now. And so it's really concerning to me the steps that have been taken back by the courts in this regard. So, God forbid we find ourselves in another situation like this a couple years down the line. Like, will there be any room for local governments and state governments to put forth regulation in times of crises? So that's where my thoughts come in. A lot of concern about what has been done in the courts to prevent the type of regulation that we see in these other countries around the world that are faring so much better than we are.
Thank you, Diane. Marion.
Sure. I like this question, and it makes me think back to an experience I had. I lived in Beijing, China for about 2 years, and I know that you really couldn't step out of your door without a level of surveillance and also government intrusion into your life. And I think that shows us what they're capable of in an emergency situation like coronavirus. I still have friends there who said that there were guards outside of all of their apartment complexes that wouldn't allow them to leave but once a week. And they had a certain day when they were allowed to leave. And I think that that's something that would be great for us to be able to establish. But I think that a lot of people talk about incrementalism, and we talk about it more in terms of seeking a positive end. But I'm also thinking back to some of the things where I'm saying there are people who have been below the law too often or treated below the law. And I think that the incremental nature of all of those situations has gotten it to a point. And I think that we can't have a conversation without starting or talking about how this country has often been guided on by anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous community work and racism. And in doing so, we've created a way to interpret the Constitution, for instance, with the Second Amendment, which to me speaks to, perpetuating this collective ability to protect our brother and sister, our neighbor, when necessary. But we have used this anti-Black racism to make it to a point where it's more about an individualism. And in countries where they are less represented by diversity, or they are not represented by what they call an original sin, but I think our sin against the natives were first. When we're a country where everything has been to make sure that there has been a subordinate class, we get to the point where we are thinking more about the people in power, are thinking more about how to retain that power, rather than thinking collectively about how to ensure that everyone is safe. And I think that's why we see such a disparity in the belief that this will actually help those around you. Folks don't actually care about that. And so, as Diane was saying, we need to figure out a way that we can respond to emergency in a way that's collective, but that goes to a place where we have to, we have to get around the states' rights, which is to me still connected to that anti-Black racism from slavery.
I'm just going to jump in quickly and say Ronaldo will get to you in just a second, but I really want our group to get ready to share their thoughts, particularly on what Julia put in there about trust issues and Diane has raised about kind of that trade-off between individual and government and the community. And then Marian just really spoke to that as well. So get ready to share your thoughts on that, and Ronaldo will have you wrap us up on this portion of our talk today.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a great question, right? Individual liberties and collective good. You know, we live in a society, right? But United States really treasures, values individual freedoms, and I'm all for that. I understand that. I did not live in China like Marianne. That sounds like a really interesting experience. But I did have, for example, where I did my PhD was at a predominantly Chinese lab. So I got many chances to talk to these scholars that were visiting for a year or two about the differences in individual freedom and surveillance in the United States and China, for example. And I treasure that here in the United States, that is valued. But and it's supposed to be a struggle, I think, when public health measures are trying to, to level the playing field, to make sure everybody's safe, individual liberties will clash. I think that's inevitable, and I think it should be. There should be checks and balances on both sides, but I think it should be reasonable. You know, one of the big problems affecting communities of color is that they don't trust the government, right? And I think everybody's here alluded to that in some way or another. And part of it is, for example, Puerto Ricans, they were experimented with by the federal government. And similar situations happen with African Americans and others, right? So when you start to politicize something like wearing a mask, something incredibly basic, you start to create clashes that are completely unnecessary in issues that are already ignited as are problematic as it is. So the lack of leadership, that was a great comment by Julia about that. I was about to talk about that right there, because we hit the 500,000 people dying by COVID. And I just wonder how many of those could have been prevented. How many of those would have led to a cure for Alzheimer's or cancer or something, or, it's an entire legacy that's lost there, right? A future legacy that's lost. And I think that it's supposed to be a struggle, but it has to be a reasonable one, right? It's when it's really challenging your individual liberties. Wearing a mask is not challenging your individual liberty. It's being thoughtful, it's being careful, it's being it's being a good neighbor. And that's my thought on it. I think it's an inevitable clash, but we can be smarter about what we choose, picking our battles with this.
Yeah, I like the way you reframe the challenge there, in kind of thinking about what's the right thing for all, not what's the thing for me. So I put in the chat, feel free to weigh in on this question, but fellows, you are our future. And so I know that we really want to hear from all of you who are on this call, and even not fellows, about kind of what are thoughts about this more perfect union going forward, rule of law, and what's our role in that? What's your role in it as we think about what we just heard, not only from Bobby and Dr. Brackney, but Julia, Diane, Marian, and Ronaldo, all very insightful comments. So you can either use chat, you can use raise your hand function, you can do old school, raise your hand on the screen. We'd love to hear from you. Clarissa.
Okay, good. I guess I'll begin. So several things said by the other persons struck my head. They made me reflect more about my initial thoughts of the insurrection and the fact that we have a damaged system and people avoiding to do the necessary. I think it's not new, as people made clear. So when Dr. Brackney said that when the rule of law is not enough and our work allows us to go forward this goal, it made me think that we have two types of obligations, like common obligations as residents, citizens, humans, and individuals that are particular to our life, like they arise because of roles in society. So I think it's harder to identify the individual's obligations because you're not always aware of which obligations these are. So the only thing I know is that today I have a new obligation, and it was a question that Diane implanted on me, like, how do you combat compliancy and silence? And my answer is, I'm not sure, but now I will be constantly thinking about this question, and I'm gonna be aware about my big and small actions and or inactions, so I never fall into compliancy or silence. So that was all this discussion make me think, and what I'm taking from it.
Oh, that's terrific. What are people's thoughts? How to answer Diane's question and give Clarissa some ideas? You know, how do you combat complacency day to day? How do you avoid silence? Whether that's in your role as lawyer or whether that's in your personal life.
I see Professor Bates is on here, so I believe I'm going to call on him. Professor Bates was our 2019 distinguished alumni for the fellowship, so I hope he has, I'm sure he has some interesting thoughts to share with us.
I'm just really enjoying the conversation. I thought some of the questions about masks as responsibilities were also just really interesting, but as a professor, and sometimes a professor of undergraduates, not just law students, the way I combat complacency and silence is I don't let them be silent. I go Socratic on them. But also, this is, so in my personal life and in sort of what I see as my obligation as an attorney and as a professor, I have started engaging in some really uncomfortable conversations. I don't let the meme on Facebook just go. I try not to engage on Facebook, but private conversations with people who I know who have put up various memes largely, but also just some of their comments about stop the steal and questions about Black Lives Matter and making false equivalencies between the two. And I try to engage them. And unfortunately, that means I have very little personal time anymore. Because fighting those fights or having those conversations, and I think it's much more useful to think of them as conversations or dialogues than debates. And I try and tell that to my students as well, that this is something where you have to listen to the other side, because as uncomfortable as it is to hear, there are occasionally, beneath the level of the rhetoric, there are some real concerns and real issues that people have been dealing with. Not all of them are legitimate, but you've got to hear them before you can engage with them.
Thank you, Professor Bates. I'm sorry I used the Socratic method to call on you just now.
Turnabout is fair play.
Yeah. Melissa, John almost everything but ordered me to call on you. So any thoughts that you had? John assured me that they would be gold, so no pressure. No.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for this great conversation. Actually, I was about to jump into this conversation because I wanted to share that this is like the debate around the rule of law. It's something that we do share as well, like on the other side of the Atlantic. In Europe, the debate has been lately been turning around the responsibility of a social network. Like, how do we regulate platform? How do we talk to the people who have like a different reality through this platform, and how do we regulate all of this? So I think that has lawyers, I think that it's a very interesting question. Like, do we add to a code of practice, and how do we regulate? Like, it's actually a business model that we have here. And I think that it's like a very interesting question. And if I may just conclude on this and share like maybe a view from France, actually the question of the rule of law, I think that in France now the debate, it's around our national motto. It's like liberty, equality, and fraternity. But what it is, and I think it's like a similar question that American is asking themselves. And we have like this movement, I think that it was like 3 years ago now, around the yellow vest people, the so-called movement. And it's all about how do we talk to these people? Like, how do we tackle like racial injustice, social related issue when this like huge divide between like Paris and the other regions, but also between like the mainland and the other French overseas territories. So it may not seem like at first that it's something that we do share on both sides of the Atlantic, but I think that it may be time like someone's like speak about alliance and allies, and I think that maybe it's something that like the transatlantic partnership can think about it, because there is also a questioning worldwide of like about what it is really the rule of law out there. Like, how do we define democracy, and how do we have a narrative that can be listened by everyone, and that can like counter this like trend of disinformation that have a huge impact on our society and on our democracy at large.
Thank you very much, Willissa. So now to the person on this Zoom call who was at the highest position of any structure that ensured the rule of law in the United States, former Secretary of Transportation, Rodney Slater, will close us out. I think you're on mute, Secretary.
Am I off now?
Yes, you're good.
Okay. Well, thank you, Justin and Dean McCabe, for moderating just a very powerful, insightful, thought-provoking discussion among our fellows. I can tell you that last year, John and I just had a wonderful experience. I personally had a wonderful experience working with him. I want everyone to know that just right off the bat. And Leslie, I see you there, and I know that you know that we were talking just constantly. But the job was, how do we keep going something that has been going for 20 years, but do it in this environment and actually take it to a higher level? And John was clear about that, very persistent about that. And you look back on 2020, notwithstanding its challenges, and we were able to do just that with the largest group of fellows in the history of the foundation. And we've got a number of people on this Zoom call who were a part of that effort with John more than 20 years ago to establish the foundation in honor of Jim Patton, who was retiring as one of our founding leaders at the time of the firm. We lost Jim in 2020. And so I think it's important to note that, but we kept his spirit going by reaching out to the young people that you've heard talk today about the critical issues of our times and to be inspired by them. And I think if anything is the story of 2020, it's tapping into the wisdom of the fellows. And I think you've seen it on display today. All of them, true leaders in their own right. And we underscore that. And so again, Justin, to you and to Dean McCabe, we thank you for just bringing us that wonderful discussion with Julia, Diane, Marion, and Ronaldo. They did a tremendous job. And then the Q&A, wonderful as well. Let me also say that I know that Alexa McCaskill with the Colorado Law School just has to be as proud as we all are of Bobby with that very powerful statement to kick things off. And really for him to tell us about his two experiences with Washington, D.C. The one that he last had that forced him, I think, to think about some of those earlier experiences and to help us understand that through just the power of norms in many respects, our democracy is a fragile flower. It is something to be respected and protected. And we can ill afford to not be mindful of that every day and in every way. And then his mention of Eisenhower. And we get an example of what a president can do. And then Marion to note that he was a graduate of Central High School and the significance of that. And the interesting thing about Central High is that it was the government saying that even the threat of violence will not stand when it comes to people exercising their rights under the law. Central was really a test of Brown in many respects. Brown in 54, Central in 57. And a president stepped forward to say to a governor and to a state, we will have none of this. And then to hear from Chief Brackney, and you know, she was very, very vulnerable in many of her expressions. The one about being an affirmative action hire, and some of the stuff that she has to deal with on a daily basis, but also how she deals with it as a true professional, with the resolve and the commitment to do the job so well that neither the living, the dead, nor the yet unborn could do it better. It came through in her expressions. And then she noted that Charlottesville, this beloved city that she serves, has become sort of an epicenter for hate. We know that feeling all too well in Arkansas with Little Rock, in many respects, recognized that way. But with the proper effort, you can fight through that. And we know that Chief Brackney will do that. And we're very, very proud to work with her as a part of our racial justice effort. Let me also, if I may, I want to just acknowledge, John, you see those members who were with the firm when you were getting this all going with Joe Brand and Mike Forshee, Rick Tausman, and then some of the newer leaders just doing a tremendous job, Rebecca Poston and Corinne Irish and all of the others. Again, this is a firm, along with Susan Bastress, one of those early partners in doing the great work and still connected with this effort, even though she's left the firm, along with Jack Nadler and others, just keeping this foundation going. And I just want to acknowledge your service as well. We also have a few friends with us. And I just think that it's important to acknowledge two past members and presidents of the National Bar Association, Walter Sutton, and the immediate past president of the National Bar Association, Dean Alfreda Robinson, and then Dr. Jerome Green, president of Shorter College and the immediate past general counsel of the African American Episcopal Church, noted very prominently by Professor Gates in his recent documentary on the Black church and its importance to the African American community, but also just another dear friend, a past president of the National Bar Association, but also former member of the Michigan State Supreme Court, former mayor of Detroit, and the first African American president of the American Bar Association, Dennis Archer. This invitation to hear our fellows has drawn the attention of a lot of leaders in the legal community. And it's something that we can be very, very proud of. I'd like to close with this, two things quickly. One is we've seen, I think, a magnificent display of legal excellence on display with the hearing of Merrick Garland over the last 2 days, who's having his confirmation hearing for his nomination to be the Attorney General of the United States. And yesterday, he almost brought me to tears. in talking about the experience of his own family and his grandparents fleeing to the US and being protected by our rule of law. And he basically said, and I think this is important to note because this is a person who had the opportunity to be on the United States Supreme Court. We know that. But he said yesterday, I can think of no other calling that requires the best of what I have to offer. That is a powerful statement by someone who truly knows and respects the law and appreciates everything that this discussion has been about today. Some of those who have been treated as being under the law rather than holding true to the expression that no person is above the law, as Marion so powerfully stated. And then the last thing is today is the 1-year anniversary of the death of Ahmaud Arbery. I remember that because 1 year ago today, I was experiencing one of the most joyous times, having a birthday brunch with my daughter and just talking about her future and talking about her generation and all of its promise and opportunity. And then when I was flying back from Boston, I started to hear just a little bit about something happening that I couldn't really understand because there was talk about people in a truck and literally my point is there is so much work to do. So much work to do. And I think because of this session today, we know that we are well able to meet the challenge of this moment. John Lewis said that about this generation in the letter that he submitted to the New York Times, I believe, the day of his, the day after he died. And then another young voice said it this way with my words to close. Little Amanda Gorman said, so let us lift our gaze, not to what stands between us, but what stands before us. We close the divide because we know to put our future first, we must first put our differences aside. We lay down our arms so that we can reach out our arms to one another. We seek harm to none and harmony for all. All the best. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Great job, everyone.
I think that's it. Thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you, everybody.
Be
Have a good-
well.